Well, in classic Cleveland Browns fashion, they haven't even been conducting a head coach search for more than 2 weeks, and already half the fan base is pretty pissed off. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, or if you are new here, then please do me a favour and hit that subscribe button. So, the Cleveland Browns head coach search is heating up. We've got a pretty substantial list of candidates. They have completed their first round of interviews with all of these candidates. There might be a couple of other guys that they're trying to get interviews with who are obviously still on playoff teams. But with the new interview rules that the NFL have implemented, which are ridiculously stupid in my opinion, that is not yet to be the case. But I do think that the Browns' next head coach will be one of the guys that they have completed an interview with already. It will be out of that list of guys, just to refresh everyone on those candidates. Obviously, Browns defensive coordinator Jim Schwartz, he has completed an interview and is scheduled for a second interview. Ravens offensive coordinator Todd Monken, he has completed an interview and has been scheduled for a second interview. Browns offensive coordinator Tommy Rees, he completed an interview. Doesn't look like he will be getting a second interview. If I'm completely honest, he will probably be the offensive coordinator for Kevin Stefanski's Atlanta Falcons within the next week. Bengals offensive coordinator Dan Pitcher, Seahawks defensive coordinator and British man Aidan Durd, Mike McDaniel, obviously formerly head coach of the Miami Dolphins, the Rams pass game specialist Nate Scheelhaase, Chargers defensive coordinator Jesse Minter, and Jaguars offensive coordinator Grant Udinski. That is the list of candidates that the Browns have completed interviews with. And as I said, I do believe that the next head coach of the Cleveland Browns will be one of the people from that list. And let's jump straight into talking about that because, of course, you know, in the last 24 hours, this has started to heat up even more with a lot of speculation, reporting, whatever we want to call it, seems to be going in the favour of Jim Schwartz being in the lead to get this job. And I just kind of want to talk about where I'm at with it, etc., etc., my favourite candidate. So before I get started, I just want to preference that, you know, I've said this before, everyone is entitled to their own opinions. This is just my opinion. Don't take it as gospel. Don't take it as, you know, if you have a different opinion to me, don't think that means that I now hate you. This is just my opinion. As I said, everyone is entitled to their opinion. So please don't get offended by any of my opinions. As I said, everyone is entitled to their own, and I'm sure everyone is going to have a different opinion on this. But, you know, everything I say today is, as I said, it's an opinion, you know, so in the end of the day, I can be completely wrong. I can be completely right. That's what an opinion is. But I say all of that to say that I think there is clearly a divide between the Cleveland Browns fan base on whether or not Jim Schwartz should be promoted to be the head coach. And just to make my position clear, no, I do not think that is a good idea whatsoever. Not even in the slightest do I think that is a good idea. Why do I not think that's a good idea? First and foremost, there is just no precedent for this. I can find 2 examples over the last 30 years where a team, you know, promoted, they made an internal hire for their head coaching position, and it actually resulted in a winning record. That was Mike Martz in St. Louis, so that tells you how long ago that was, and Jason Garrett in Dallas. They are the only 2 internal hires in the last 30 years to actually have a winning record. Every other internal hire does not, and not just a losing record, a terrible record, and they were genuinely awful, and in most cases were fired after 1 season. And even those 2 guys that did have winning records, they both had losing records in the playoffs, and obviously didn't result in much postseason success. So first and foremost, the precedent is just not there. Yes, I can admit that this is probably a bias from me as obviously a younger person, but I also don't really believe in hiring a 60-year-old I mean, Todd Monken, a 60-year-old first-time head coach, that is just, I'll be completely honest, borderline disgusting to me. I don't even, I can't even fathom the idea of doing that, hiring a 60-year-old first-time head coach. People can say that I'm being ageist here. I understand it, but that is just unfathomable to me. And then in Jim Schwartz's case, it's a 60-year-old retread. Like, this is a guy who has been an NFL head coach, wasn't a very good NFL head coach. This is a guy that had Matt Stafford and Calvin Johnson and resulted in one winning record, one playoff appearance in 5 seasons. People can argue that he went into a bad situation. I get that. But the guy we just sacked came into a worse situation than that and had more success than what Jim Schwartz did in Detroit. So doesn't really make much sense to me there. So you're essentially hoping that a guy that, when he was a head coach 15 years ago, wasn't very good, hasn't had any head coaching interviews since then until now, when we gave him an interview and the Ravens have given him an interview, which I'm convinced they have just done so to fuck with the Browns. So it's not like this is a guy that has been in demand for the last 10 years that you're then promoting. I just think it's an absolutely ridiculous thing to do. And I say all of this, and I've obviously had some fun with this on Twitter. There's been a lot of debates with this on Twitter, and people think that because I have this opinion that I don't like Jim Schwartz. I love Jim Schwartz. I am very grateful for what he has done here as the Browns defensive coordinator. I think he's been fantastic. He's done an amazing job as the leader of this defense. But that doesn't mean that I should then just make him my head coach. I'm sorry, but I just cannot get to that point where I'm going, well, yeah, because the defense was good, that means we should make him our head coach. The problem of this team has not been the defense. Everyone has been clamoring for this offense to get fixed for the last 2 seasons. And what's our response to doing that? Hiring the guy that was the defensive coordinator. I don't understand it. Everything that this team needs, everything that this team has said. Andrew Berry himself came out in a press conference recently saying how they're looking to pair an offensive mind with this defense and all of that stuff. So to then just go and promote, have an internal promotion for your 60-year-old defensive coordinator when you've just said that, just makes absolutely no sense to me. If it is the case, which obviously a lot of people are reporting that it's looking likely, I have to. I'd have to believe that Andrew Berry wasn't the one that made this decision, because I just can't see how Andrew Berry and everything that how Andrew Berry operates, and especially even the fact that this is probably his last shot to hire a head coach. He's got one shot at this, and you're going to hire the 60-year-old defensive coordinator who's already in your building, who was hired by the guy that you just sacked. It genuinely makes no fucking sense to me. I'm going to be completely honest here. I know a lot of people like Jim Schwartz and want him as the head coach. And again, I'm not criticising you for having that belief. You guys have that belief. But for me, with everything that where the Browns are, with everything that they've said, I just don't understand how that makes any sense at all. And if that is what they do, it's going to be very hard for me to not just believe that this is Jimmy Haslam essentially saying, well, I can't really be arsed with any of these guys. Let's just give him a promotion and I can sack all of you in a year's time, draft Arch Manning and then go from there. That is just what I would not be able to escape that belief. And obviously, if that is the case, then how can you get excited? How can you get motivated behind a strategy that is quite clearly designed to not fucking work? So that's where I'm at with Jim Schwartz, and you can throw Todd Monken into there as well. Am I being ageist? Maybe, maybe it is a young person thing for me to say, but I don't understand it. We've just seen, for the last 2 decades, 2 head coaches on our biggest rivals dominate us for 2 decades long, and our response to when they finally fuck off out of the division is let's hire the 60-year-old who at best is going to be here for 5 years. I have higher aspirations than that. I want to do to the Ravens and Steelers what they've done to us the last 2 decades, and that's bring someone in here that can win and win for the next 2 decades against these guys. I don't want to be bringing in a 60-year-old. I'm sorry, that's just where I'm at. Let me know if if you think I'm being completely unfair here. Please let me know. But it's just where I'm at, and not that I rely on anyone's opinion to form any of my opinions, but I'll be honest, I'm actually kind of surprised that a lot of people are in agreement with me on this. I thought that this might not be the most popular take, but it does seem to be that this is actually probably the more popular take on social media amongst Browns fans, that they don't want Jim Schwartz to be hired and given the promotion, whereas I thought it would be, the other way around. But as I said, there's a clear divide between the fan base. There's a clear divide. I think there's obviously an age divide here. Obviously, if you're an older person, you're probably more inclined to be happy with Jim Schwartz, etc. Completely understand that, not taking that away from anyone. And I'm sure Facebook will be very happy to learn the news that Jim Schwartz is in the front running for the job when they get that news in about 3 days. But obviously, that's just where I'm at. So, as I said, that's just my opinion. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but for me, promoting Jim Schwartz, and it's not even just it's not even specifically Jim Schwartz. Like, it's the idea of firing someone because the offense has been that fucking bad for 2 years, and then just responding to that by just offering a internal promotion to your 60-year-old retread defensive coordinator. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And Todd Monken, I mean, don't get me wrong. People can say, oh, this guy's, led some amazing offenses, etc., etc. 60-year-old first-time head coach is a bigger red flag to me than a 30-year-old head coach, first-time head coach that we will obviously get into. But that's a bigger red flag for me. I'm sorry, I'm not interested in a 60-year-old first-time head coach. That's a big no-no from me. And unfortunately, they are the two guys that have their second interview scheduled. So as I said, a lot of Browns fans are getting pretty pissed off with this, even though that, the head coach search hasn't even been 2 weeks long. But it's quite easy to understand why, because as I said, I'm getting pretty pissed off with that form of thinking, because it just doesn't make any sense to me. And obviously, people can say, well, the defensive players are going to be pounding the table for Jim Schwartz. And I get that. I understand that. But, just a gentle reminder, the offensive players were pounding the table for Freddie Kitchens in 2019. And we all know how that worked out. I'm obviously not comparing Freddie Kitchens to Jim Schwartz. This is apples and fucking sofas, not even apples and oranges. But I'm just trying to make the point that, I don't think that players' endorsement is quite the factor that we think it is for how good these guys can be. And I will just say this as someone that has his jersey behind me, as someone that has arguably been his biggest supporter. I'll argue with my own mother over this man. But if I find out that Myles Garrett has been pounding the table and going to the ownership and going to Andrew Berry and pounding the table for Jim Schwartz, then I don't want to hear that man ever complain about the offensive production again, because, in that case, you've made your own bed, go and sleep in it. You cannot even remotely sit there in a press conference and go, oh, well, I don't understand why this offense isn't, helping out this defense. We all fucking know why, Miles. It's because you pounded the table for the 60-year-old retread. That's exactly why. So, as I said, people are getting annoyed. I'm going to get annoyed. If I keep talking about this, I'm going to just end up going on a rant. So that is my thoughts on Jim Schwartz. As I said, if it happens, I'm obviously going to support him. I already support him as the defensive coordinator. If you're able to keep him as the defensive coordinator, absolutely all on board for that. I think that would be the best case if you can bring him in. And, people have thrown out the idea of, well, why don't you just promote Jim Schwartz and make, one of these young offensive guys that you're interested in the offensive coordinator? That's never going to happen. No, none of these guys who have head coach buzz are going to come to the Cleveland Browns to be the offensive coordinator. Even if it's offering play, oh yeah, well, one of these guys doesn't call plays in his spot, so what if we offer him play calling? We really fucking overrate play calling to the point where we actually think that would happen. absolutely no chance is any of these guys going to come and be the offensive coordinator for a Jim Schwartz head coach team. That's just not going to happen. Just completely remove that from any thinking, any kind of plan. That is not going to happen. If you hire Jim Schwartz as the head coach, you're going to have to take a flyer on a retread at offensive coordinator or promote some, unknown guy that has not done it before. None of these guys are coming here to be the OC, even if you offer calling plays. Play calling, I don't understand why it's being so overrated. It is literally having a feel for calling the right plays on a call sheet. 90% of what goes into an offensive game plan goes into it happens in the week leading up to it. It's got nothing to do with the guy calling the fucking play sheet. I don't understand why we overrate this. But as I said, guys, I need to stop. Otherwise, I'm going to go on a rant. That's my thoughts on Jim Schwartz. Now, you might be thinking, well, if that's your thoughts, Ollie, who do you want as the Cleveland Browns head coach? And it's pretty an easy answer for me. And, as I said, kind of with the whole, well, if we're trying to do the offensive stuff and pairing it with this defensive stuff, why would you hire the defensive guy? That's why it's quite an easy answer for me. And I'll be honest, there's 3 guys that I would, who are my favourites, shall I say, and that I would hire above everyone else. And that is Jaguars offensive coordinator Grant Udinski, Mike McDaniel, former head coach of the Miami Dolphins, and the Rams pass game coordinator Nate Scheelhaase. Now, why is that my logic? Why do I want to hire, a 30-year-old that's never done it before, etc., etc.? Now, before I get into Grant Udinski, just I will just do a little bit on him. Just why these 3 guys as a whole is, as I said, everything that I said with the offense that you're going to lose with Jim Schwartz is what you would gain with hiring one of these guys. If you can hire one of these guys as the head coach and keep Jim Schwartz as the defensive coordinator, that would be the best case scenario. But if the fear of losing Jim Schwartz prevents you from hiring one of these guys, then I will swim across the Atlantic Ocean to drive Jim Schwartz down to Baltimore if that's the case. I'm sorry, but you can't let the fear of losing your 60-year-old defensive coordinator stop you from hiring the person that you think is best for the job. That is just a recipe for disaster and a recipe for everyone to get fired this time next year anyway. As I said, this team needs an offensive overhaul. This team needs an injection into that side of the ball. That is why I have always been in the boat of bringing in a offensive guy. And as I said with the defensive kind of side, and obviously it applies, to any kind of retread, retreads don't have a great history of working out in the NFL, which is why if you can take a swing on a young offensive guy that's getting buzz, that hasn't been a head coach, is going to be a first-time head coach, that's usually why teams do it. You look at the NFL over the last decade, that is the most common head coaching candidate that you will find, and there is a reason for that. It's just in today's NFL, with how it is offensive focused, that is just why teams will always go for, they will always take a swing on the young offensive guy as a first-time head coach than they would over a retread or, an older defensive guy or whatever. I mean, even a younger defensive guy. You look at the current playoff, all the head coaches that made the playoffs, most of them, pretty much 90% of them are first-time head coaches, and all but, 2, I think, are offensive guys. So, the whole kind of, when everyone else zigs, you zag, that maybe applies, but it feels like what the Browns are trying to do is, when everyone else zigs, you zags, and the Browns are going, well, no, can we just go in a straight line, actually, and just hope that even though we're doing the same thing that we always do, something actually changes. There are times where you should just follow suit and do what most people do because it's been proven to work. So that's why, obviously, the Rams pass game coordinator, Nate Scheelhaase, who, people can say with him and Grant Udinski, all of this stuff, well, you don't know if they're going to be good. You don't know if they're going to lead men and all of this stuff. I completely understand that. But the point is, you identify someone that is clearly a bright, up-and-coming offensive mind. And then you take the swing on whether or not they can do those things. And that's what teams do. And you find that out. I'd rather take the swing on that and be wrong about one of these guys than just settle for Jim Schwartz. That's just how I'm always going to believe a team should operate, and that's no difference for the Cleveland Browns. So that's why those guys, if I had to do it in order, it would be Grant Udinski number 1, Mike McDaniel number 2, and Scheelhaase number 3. Scheelhaase, if you read everything about him, this is an exciting guy. This is a guy that clearly understands offense, but you could argue maybe lesser ready for the job than some of the other guys, obviously not even being an offensive coordinator in the NFL. Mike McDaniel, I would be completely on board with. This is a guy that, yes, usually, as I said, retreads don't have that much success, but, a guy that had a winning record in Miami, you could argue didn't have the best situation in Miami in terms of, the quarterback's brain turning to mush, and all of that stuff, the best players getting injured, etc., etc. And, even with all of that, this is a guy that was able to run an offense, one of the better offenses in the NFL. This is a guy that was, the head coach of a team that scored 70 fucking points. I know a lot of people will say, well, we don't have Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. I understand that, but it's not just those two players. This is a guy that can get guys open, and even more so, obviously, on the focus of the AFC North. This is one of the better run game schemers in the NFL, in my opinion. There's not many better guys at developing a run game in the NFL than Mike McDaniel. So I do feel like he would fit really well here as well. It does feel more like a move that you would make if you can keep Jim Schwartz, because I do think pairing Mike McDaniel with Jim Schwartz would be a great thing. I think you bring that offensive philosophy here with what we already have with this defense, and I think you can win games as soon as next year if that's the case. People might say, well, why don't you bring Mike McDaniel in as the offensive coordinator? As I said earlier, that's not fucking happening. No team is going to join the Browns as the offensive coordinator over teams like the Detroit Lions and the LA fucking Rams. That's just not going to happen. Obviously, the Rams are about to lose their offensive coordinator, I imagine, so that would be why that opening happens. Seattle might lose theirs, so there's going to be even more better openings at offensive coordinator. Why on earth would a team come and do that for the Browns? And even if they would, why would you want to do that? Because then you have the chance of losing the younger guy, the offensive younger guy that then just gets hired as a head coach somewhere else, instead of losing the guy, the 60-year-old defensive coordinator who, even though has been the defensive coordinator for the number 2 defense in the NFL the last 3 years, has one interview to show for it. You're not going to lose Jim Schwartz to a head coaching position, more than likely, whereas you would 100% lose the offensive guy to a head coach position. So that's why you would make the offensive guy the head coach. But as I said, fully would be on board with Mike McDaniel. I think that's something I would get quite excited about. But my number 1 option, and let me just explain why, because I know there's obviously a big debate on this, it is Grant Udinski. And people are going to say, well, this is a guy that hasn't called plays. If you want my answer to that, go to what I said earlier about play calling. I think it's completely overrated, and I far value offensive philosophy, offensive scheme more than I do fucking play calling. And this is a guy that is clearly a bright offensive mind. I mean, if you've had Kevin O'Connell and Liam Cohen singing your praises to the extent that they have about you, I think you understand offense. So this is a guy who obviously, started at Baylor as a graduate assistant. He got the job at Baylor because he slept in his fucking car in a car park and just turned up every single day. This is a guy that is determined to get to where he wants to get to. Nothing proves that more than that. Got his first shot at the Panthers as a coaching assistant, and then went with Kevin O'Connell to Minnesota. And the first year that he spent in Minnesota is actually a big part of why I think people think he actually is ready for this job, even though he's only 30 and has only been a offensive coordinator for 1 year. And that's because he basically was Kevin O'Connell's assistant as the head coach. He shadowed Kevin O'Connell for a whole season, watched how he runs the team, every aspect of being an NFL head coach he learned from Kevin O'Connell. That was literally his role for that year. People want to compare him to Kevin O'Connell, of course. Sean McVay as well. And, whilst those guys had slightly a bit more on the field experience in terms of coaching, I would argue that Grant Udinski actually has more backroom experience when it comes to coaching and when it comes to actually being a head coach of a football team. This is a guy that has had that perspective. He has seen what it takes to be a head coach and everything that is required to not just be the leader of the offense or not just be the leader of that quarterback room, but be the leader of the whole fucking team. And, so Kevin O'Connell is probably the most similar comparison you can make. This is a guy who only had half a season of play calling experience before he went to Minnesota, obviously became the head coach and the play caller. And I don't think anyone can argue that that has not been a success. Kevin O'Connell is one of the best, one of the better offensive coaches in the NFL. And then obviously Sean McVay, I know everyone wants to talk about how he was 3 years an offensive coordinator, which I'm not going to deny. He was an offensive coordinator for 3 years in Washington, but he did only call plays for 1.5 of those seasons. So at this point, it does... I think the comparisons are stupid anyway. It's unfair to compare anyone to McVay. It's unfair to compare someone to Kevin O'Connell. Every single coach is different. But if you do actually want to make the comparisons, I think it gets to a point where we're just splitting hairs over 1.5 years of extra play calling experience, which if you're someone like me and doesn't really think that's that big of a deal, that's not something that I'm going to be splitting hairs about. And, as I said, if you do want to do that comparison, you've essentially got two guys who had slightly more on the field coaching experience and a guy that had slightly more backroom coaching experience. At the end of the day, Grant Udinski is going to be an NFL head coach. Whether that's this year, whether that's next year or the year after, he is going to be an NFL head coach. I would probably bet everything that I own on that being the case. So why do you make this move? Because it's simply getting ahead of the curve, taking a swing on a guy that is going to be one of the hottest head coaching candidates, in my opinion, in the NFL over the next couple of years. If you're in a situation next year when you go 5-11 after hiring Jim Schwartz, which is probably what would happen, and you sack everyone and you try and hire him, are you going to have more of a chance of hiring when maybe, a couple of other teams have openings that they're interested in him for? Obviously, that's less of a chance. And, some people might counter that and say, well, nobody's interested in him, so why should we hire him? And as I said, it's simply getting ahead of the curve. I'd rather be wrong about this guy than watch him go somewhere else and be a great NFL head coach. So, people can say, oh, well, you probably only heard of him last week. Thankfully, not all of us live under a rock. Anyone that actually watches the NFL as a whole, as I try to stress, to many Browns fans, that I understand that a lot of Browns fans just want to watch the Browns, but I do think it's valuable actually watching and keeping up to date with the rest of the NFL, because otherwise you get kind of a clouded and narrowed view of what your team should do and what your team is doing. So anyone that actually pays attention to the NFL as a whole has known about Grant Udinski for over a year. I've known about Grant Udinski since he was at the Minnesota Vikings. This is a guy that has got a lot of spotlight in terms of a future head coaching candidate. If you haven't seen his interview with Ari Meritov, is it? I can't remember that guy's name. Not even sure he's a real person. Then I encourage you to go watch that as well. So that's where I'm at with it. That's why I have that kind of belief. I'm always going to have that belief. It's just something I don't think I can shake out of me. I'm always going to want to take the swing on the up-and-coming person than I am to just settle for a candidate. And that's not even just coaches. I mean, you probably can tell from my draft videos in the off-season that's kind of my thought for everything. I'm always going to want to take the upside pick. In the end of the day, the goal is always to win a Super Bowl. The goal is not to, well, we were really bad, so if we can get to 9-10 wins and, maybe make a playoff experience, I just can't think like that. My goal is I'm always looking at Super Bowl. And, people can laugh at me and say, well, you're a Browns fan. What a stupid thing to do. But that's just who I am. So as someone that has that belief and is always looking at the highest accomplishment and highest achievement we can get, then I'm always going to want to go for the candidate that I think can provide the highest ceiling. So that's why Grant Udinski is number one on my list, and that's why Grant Udinski is number one on a lot of people's lists. People that are a lot smarter than me are obviously big fans of Grant Udinski as well. Big big fans of his offensive philosophy. This is a guy who was, the quarterback coach for Sam Darnold when he had his 40 touchdown, 4,000 yard season for the Minnesota Vikings that earned him $50 million a year nearly, completely turned his career around, and then obviously was the offensive coordinator for the Jaguars this year when they won 13 games, had one of the better offenses they've had under Trevor Lawrence, and obviously the efficient play that they got out of Trevor Lawrence this year as well. This is a guy who, even at 30, has a proven track record of working with good NFL offenses. Yes, he's only 30, but in the end of the day, guys, at what point do we say, maybe someone has risen through the ranks so quickly because they're actually really fucking good? Maybe that's the case. It's not his fault that some guys remain position coaches for a decade. That's got nothing to do with Grant Udinski. Whether you think it's deserved or undeserved, this is a guy that has risen through the ranks very, very quickly. And I think there's a reason for that. So that's why he is my number one target. As I said, I'd rather be wrong about a guy who could potentially be a unicorn head coach, someone that could potentially be your head coach for the next 2-3 fucking decades. I'd rather be wrong on that guy than settle for a candidate like Jim Schwartz. So that's where I'm at. But as I said, it's not just Grant Udinski or bust. I would be more than happy with Mike McDaniel. I would be happy with Scheelhaase as well. And they're the three guys that I would kind of circle as, before yesterday, I would have circled those guys as the three more likely candidates as well. So it's not just that they're my favourite guys, but with, as I kind of said earlier, with everything, with how the Browns has been the last 2 years with the offense, with everything that Andrew Berry has said about pairing an offensive mind and not exactly like the hottest guy on the market, but maybe a guy that's, 1 or 2 years away from being a head coach and all of that stuff, that just points the finger to those three guys. I mean, I'd probably remove Mike McDaniel from that and add Dan Pitcher into that and say that, Dan Pitcher, Nate Scheelhaase and Grant Udinski, they're the three guys that fit that mold the most. But obviously we're getting reporting now that actually in a very shocking turn of events, it's going to be the 60-year-old internal promotion that's actually going to get the job instead. But that's where I'm at. That's why they're my three guys, and not just my three favourite guys, but as I said before the last 24 hours, the three guys I thought would be, the candidates that the Browns target the most. Just to quickly kind of go over some of the other guys, because you never know. Chargers defensive coordinator Jesse Minter, we did interview him yesterday. That would be a great hire, don't get me wrong. I just don't think it's very realistic. This is a guy that has basically had an interview at every single team. I don't think he's going to choose the Cleveland Browns if he's given the choice when he literally has the pick of the field, essentially. And even if you were able to get him in here, if you're a Schwartz guy, Schwartz would have to go because they are completely different defensive philosophies. This is a guy who has been very, very successful in a 3-4 zone-heavy scheme, which is the opposite of what the Cleveland Browns do. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that if they had the chance to hire him, this means that you shouldn't. Of course not. Any good coach can adapt to his players, or vice versa. Good players can adapt to their coach's scheme, but you can't just ignore that. That has to be recognised, that you would essentially be changing your entire defensive philosophy. Miles has spoken actually publicly in the past about how he would not like to play in a 3-4. So obviously you'd have to get him on board as well. And obviously with a whole defense that has essentially been primed to be a man-heavy defense. I mean, the Browns run the most man in the NFL. The Chargers are top three in the least amount of man. Chargers run, I think, the second most zone in the NFL last year. The Browns ran the least most zone in the NFL last year. So it's not like splitting hairs. This is a huge difference in philosophy and obviously production from what Jesse Minter has gotten in the Chargers to what obviously Jim Schwartz has gotten out of the Browns here. But as I said, even with that being said, that shouldn't stop you from hiring the guy if that's where you want to go and that's what you have. He's going to be a good head coach, I'm sure of it, and that's why he is a hot candidate. I mentioned him earlier, Bengals offensive coordinator Dan Pitcher. This is a guy who's been with the Bengals for quite a while, hasn't really got much buzz elsewhere, but he's really loved in the Bengals organization. Joe Burrow speaks really highly of him. A couple of the Browns guys that kind of, somewhat intertwined with the Bengals. They have nothing but good things to say about him. This is a guy that has obviously worked with Joe Burrow, as I said. So you can understand the thinking there. But again, I think I wouldn't be exactly that against it. As I said, it supports my philosophy of, young offensive first-time head coaches. But if that was the case, I would rather go Udinski or Scheelhaase over Pitcher. But as I said, I wouldn't be entirely against it. And then finally, Seahawks defensive coordinator Aidan Durd, who I would just want purely for business. I mean, a British head coach for the UK Browns fan channel, that would be great for business. But no, in all seriousness, I did think that maybe at first I thought, there might be a chance here because, a young guy taking a swing, etc. He obviously is a defensive guy, but you never know. But I think it's probably more likely that Aidan Durd probably gets a play calling defensive coordinator job before he does get a head coaching job. And while I said you're not going to get any offensive coordinator to come to the Browns, you might be able to lure in a defensive coordinator, because what other team in the NFL has Myles Garrett? They don't. None of them do. So the chance to coach Myles Garrett alone and obviously coach this defense is obviously far more appealing to a candidate than it would be, obviously, this offense. But that's the guys that the Browns have interviewed so far. My thoughts on them. As I said, there is a couple of guys, Chris Scheelhaase, that apparently the Browns are interested. I mean, Mary Kay keeps trying to pound it that we're going to be interviewing Chris Scheelhaase, but every report, around that suggests that we aren't going to be interviewing Chris Scheelhaase. So, as I said at the start, the kind of buzz from the Browns local media seems to be that it's going to be Jim Schwartz. But if you're someone like me that is not really on board with that, thankfully, as kind of shown with that Chris Scheelhaase stuff, nobody's actually been more incorrect about the Browns head coaching search so far than the Browns local media. So, if you're worried about that, then that should provide you some hope. But obviously, as I said, that's my thoughts on the candidates. I do think it's going to be one of the guys that I have spoken about. If I was a betting man, I would probably have to say it's going to be Jim Schwartz right now, because I just think everything that we've seen, obviously the Cleveland Browns organization tend to make very stupid decisions, and I think this would just be another example of that. So, if I did have to make an answer right now, I think it would be Jim Schwartz, but still clinging on to hope that the Browns do actually, decide that they're not going to just waste all of our time and just hire the person they could have made the interim halfway through the season, and are actually going to go through on what they said about obviously trying to pair an offensive mind with this defense. I'd like to think that they're actually going to stick with that. So hopefully we do get some second interviews scheduled for guys like Grant Udinski, for guys like even Mike McDaniel, Scheelhaase, Pitcher, etc., because I think that would be a much better route to go down than promoting Jim Schwartz. But at the end of the day, whoever they hire, I'm going to support, because I am a Cleveland Browns fan. That is what I do. But it doesn't mean that I'm not going to sit here on my channel and get annoyed about it, because this is my channel and I'm allowed to do that. But as I said, that's my thoughts, guys. Let me know what you guys think. Again, everyone is entitled to their opinion. If you think I am completely off on this, please let me know. Let's not use mean words, but you can shout at me as much as you want. I encourage it. As I always say, debate is very important. Conversation is very important. No one wants to live in an echo chamber. I like being challenged on my views. I like being challenged on my opinions, because that makes us all smarter at the end of the day. So let me know what your guys' thoughts are. Are you for or against Jim Schwartz? Are you like me? You'd rather one of these younger guys? Let me know in the comments. But as always, thank you so much for watching. If you do enjoy my content, then please drop this video a like. Hit that subscribe button. It's free, but it really, really helps out my channel. You can also check the links in the description to see where you can follow and interact with me on social media. As I always say, I'm trying to build a community of Cleveland Browns fans, and even if that means I only get to talk to one fan a day, I'm happy, because I'm talking Browns football with the best fan base in the world. Thanks again for watching, guys. Have an amazing weekend. Hopefully you don't get as enraged by this Cleveland Browns coaching search as I am. But most importantly, as always, go Browns.